And without further delay, Dr. Pollock.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brittany, for the introduction, and to all of you for making your way here on a Thursday afternoon. I really love the chance to get to talk about my research, which is indeed from my brand new book, Synthesizing Hope. And there's a lot going on in the book as a whole, but so what I wanted to do today is to focus on telling you a little bit about the constraints and conditions of possibility around the enterprise of drug discovery in South Africa, and then also get into some of these questions about, okay, what are the opportunities for drug development in this specific area of green chemistry. So that's actually chapter 6 in the book, Hope and Flow. But if you'd like to find out more about the roles of African scientists or other things, then you can check out the other materials or ask me in the Q&A. All right, so here's a Temba Pharmaceuticals. So this is a small drug discovery and development company that was situated in the, sorry, I thought I'd turn that off. Sorry about that. Gosh. So this is a drug discovery company that was founded in 2009 by an international elite team of drug discovery scientists and local South African scientists with the mission of finding new drugs for TB, HIV, and malaria. And there were a few things that made this group of scientists think that, that this was an exciting kind of opportunity that might be feasible here in the outskirts of Johannesburg. But then there were also a lot of constraints. And one of the things that was most striking to me in this research was that some of the conditions of the possibility and the constraints were actually the same kinds of things. So this main areas in which there were conditions of possibility had to do with infrastructure. So why did they think it was possible to do drug discovery research in South Africa, find new cures for TB, HIV, and malaria in South Africa? It's because of infrastructure. They also thought that it was possible because of democratic imperatives. And there was also a lot of global interest, including among elite drug discovery scientists. But each of these layers also presented its own areas of constraints. So the infrastructure also constrained the possibility. The democratic imperatives, the need to be accountable to a democratic state, also constrained possibilities. And the very narrow scope of global interests in some key ways also constrained possibilities. So to think through how this works, right? So maybe the most surprising element of this drug discovery company when I went there in 2010 to start my research was that it was situated on the grounds of a historic dynamite factory. So this was actually the largest Nobel factory in the world in its early 20th century heyday. And this space, right, is very much tells its own story about history of science and technology in Southern Africa as well. So the idea was that in the late 19th century, early 20th century, South African mining companies wanted local access to dynamite and needed to kind of set up some local manufacture. There was a lot of hiccups along the way in setting up local manufacture of dynamite, but eventually it did work. So the state, in collaboration with private partners, set up a licensed Nobel factory and served the mines in that way. This then also became the grounds of the AECI, which is the African Explosives and Chemical Industries, which was the major leader of innovation in South Africa all throughout the 20th century. And even today. And so this was kind of the context in which they worked. This infrastructure actually provides more than just kind of pretty, picturesque buildings for a pharmaceutical company. It also provides another key thing which many South African cities don't have, which is a robust electrical grid. And so if you want to do drug discovery and development in a place like Nigeria, you would normally have to actually manufacture your own electricity as well. And so that becomes very expensive. Here, you can plug into low-cost electricity from the grid because they're making explosive materials nearby, and it's very reliable. Another piece of the infrastructure that was available is education. So in South Africa, there are elite universities which were set up, it's true, with very particular audiences in mind. These universities, like the University of Cape Town and the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, were set up to build a settler colonial workforce that would do things like research at the AECI and do things in mining innovation that would feed the country of South Africa. Now, in a democratic era, there's a lot of contestation. I'm not sure if folks have heard about the Rhodes Must Fall movement. There's a statue of Rhodes in front of the University of Cape Town that was taken down because students protested that they didn't like the colonial legacy of their universities. But at the same time, these universities provide training not just for South African scientists, but also for scientists from around the region who then sometimes stay and work in South Africa. And so this is a piece of infrastructure because what it means is that in South Africa, relative to other places, you actually have a highly skilled workforce. You have people with PhDs in chemistry who you could hire to do your drug discovery and development. And the infrastructure of the labs is actually very much like what you would find here, or certainly at my previous University of Georgia Tech. If you were to go into a medicinal chemistry lab here, you might see very similar looking materials that are part of a global network of synthetic chemistry. And so this infrastructure also existed as well. However, in each of these areas, the infrastructure also operated as a bit of a constraint. So one way to think about this is just space. So, I think sometimes like in our kind of on-demand economy, and certainly in a place like this where you can get your Amazon, I don't know, can you get your Amazon delivered same day here in Phoenix? Yeah, right, so you get kind of this attitude, right, of like, oh, okay, material things can just materialize for me automatically on my demand. That's not true for synthetic chemists. You have to import reagents from far away. And so even though you can see that in these airline networks, South Africa is much closer to Europe than many places in between, in terms of like how long it would take things to get places, it still means that the reagents that you would have delivered would be much, much slower than if you were trying to have reagents delivered to you here in North America, or even in India or China, where the pharmaceutical development manufacturing is much further along. And so the infrastructure is pretty good, and yet your real barriers compared to North America or India or China. Another issue then comes up with each of the other elements of infrastructure that I've mentioned. So the universities are excellent, but they are not necessarily training people with these kinds of missions in mind. And so there's going to need to be some supplemental education if you're going to want to actually build drug discovery and development. And that is very related, in fact, to the mining situation. So the overwhelming focus of the innovation sector is around mining on the one hand and information technology on the other. And so it's very hard to kind of eke out a space within that landscape for drug discovery and development. Insofar as there is hope for really building this space, it's because of democratic imperatives. So democratic imperatives are the second thing that I think really set the context for why it's possible, conceivable, to do drug discovery and development in South Africa. And so obviously most of you will recognize Nelson Mandela, the first democratically elected president of South Africa, elected in 1994. And he came to power at the same time that the HIV epidemic was really coming to prominence in Southern Africa and in South Africa in particular. And he was the subject of, there was a lawsuit in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It was actually called Big Pharma versus Nelson Mandela. This is obviously very bad PR for the global pharmaceutical industry because he was seen as an icon of multiracial democracy, and you don't want to be suing the icon of multiracial democracy in the late 1990s in order to deny access to AIDS drugs for South Africans. This case was successful. South Africa won. Big Pharma had to drop the case. South Africans were allowed to import drugs from India. But what this did actually became itself a bit of a constraint, because it wasn't that South Africans could now make their own AIDS drugs, it was that they could import them from elsewhere, which actually makes it harder to develop your own industry. There were very good reasons for this. So notably, obviously it's an emergency when you're dealing with an HIV crisis on the order of magnitude that South Africa was. So it's an emergency. They have to get drugs right away. India already has the ability to manufacture them, so get them from India. That's fantastic. It also means that South Africa didn't really change its intellectual property laws. It just kind of made an exception. So South Africa has robust intellectual property laws, which you would expect of a developed country, which makes sense because they signed on to international trade agreements under apartheid, and the white minority was a developed country. But this kind of history of the democratic demands for access of drugs actually makes it kind of tricky to do what Temba was trying to do, of make science that's relevant for the people. So, we could just import from India rather than make it ourselves. And so, this kind of is a challenge that emerges. So there are people who are demanding that South Africa do research into especially the intersection of TB and HIV, which is understudied globally. And there are eager South African scientists who are willing to do that. This is actually not a photo of Temba. The scientists at Temba I protected their identities. This is something that is often necessary when you're doing a corporate ethnography, especially, of course, when you name the company. So it's a small company, and people could easily find out who was who in the interviews. But if you would like to see a few of the scientists who are in the story, and you see a little bit about their perspectives, you can find a link to a multimedia webpage sort of design on my website that has an interview with a few of the scientists who talk about exactly this thing of, I wanted to make drugs that were relevant to people in my region. I want to use my chemistry skills, my excellent education, and serve the people. This is what, it really speaks to, this broader post-1994 South African mindset in which these young scientists very much wanted to be part of building for the Rainbow Nation. So the bench scientists at Temba were multiracial group of scientists, so black and white and Asian South Africans, as well as black Africans from Zambia, Zimbabwe, and other neighboring countries, DRC. But all of them really bought into this vision of okay, builders are wanted, there's something that my country needs, I'm going to go above and beyond and do that work. So here's how the democratic imperatives are really helpful for this mission, because it's very motivating to say, okay, I'm going to solve the needs of my own people. It's not an abstraction, it's something that I care about myself. And the government, too, got behind this. So Temba received received its startup funding from the South African government, and in exchange the government received a 51% share of the company. And the idea was that this would do things like make the government have a say in whether the prices of the drugs and in all of these different elements to make sure that they really were serving the people. And so the Technology Innovation Agency, which is part of the Department of Science and Technology, could see, okay, there's a value in having science that serves the needs of the people. But these democratic imperatives turned out in a few ways to also be really important constraints. So the one that comes to mind to most people when you're talking about development issues in Africa is around corruption. And yes, that is true, right? So there is a serious problem with corruption. There's corruption within the Technology Innovation Agency and within the Department of Science and Technology. Money is wasted, and it becomes actually harder to make decisions in this context too, where there isn't sufficient trust. But I think that this is actually a relatively small issue relative to the broader needs of neoliberal governance. So what I would suggest is that actually corruption's been a problem in South Africa throughout. So under settler colonialism, with the founding of the dynamite factory, this was a huge problem. So the guy who initially got the tender to make dynamite in South Africa actually illegally just didn't make it and just imported it and sold it at a huge markup. And this is not a new problem. But what is a new problem is with the demands that are on neoliberal governance, it's really hard to fund projects that have a long timeline. They need to fund timelines that have a return on investment within kind of an election cycle. And so when the Technology Innovation Agency officials who were excited about a Temba, when it was time for them to rotate off, there was not necessarily the level of interest in drug discovery anymore. So they thought, you know what? There were many people at the Technology Innovation Agency. They're working in all these different sectors. And there were people who said, you know what? We don't have the money and the time to invest in drug discovery. We need to leave that to rich countries who can afford to waste money on long-term projects that may have no results. And we're going to focus on things like apps and other information technology things where we can sell them right away. And then a few other projects as well related to astronomy and some other areas where they felt like, okay, this is where we have a competitive advantage. So, but this ultimately was the undoing of the company. So the fact that the government was no longer willing to fund the company, was no longer willing to kind of keep pouring money in without actually having any drugs, was what made it unfeasible for the company to continue. So they did have some kind of ways of making money. They did some contract chemistry, they did some other things, but they weren't able to get all the way to the drug discovery and development with just a half dozen years of funding from the government. But this, speaks to then, so like democracy is both a plus and a limitation. But I want to see this as a bit connected to the ways that international interest is also this kind of plus and limitation. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, certainly when I was growing up, for South Africa as a site of hope. And that was true not only for kind of very politically oriented people, but for lots of other folks, including drug discovery scientists. So I first learned about this whole project from Dennis Liotta at Emory University. So at that time, I was at Georgia Tech. So I spent 10 years on the faculty of Georgia Tech before going to Emory. And I happened to hear this guy talk, Dennis Liotta. I had no idea actually what a big deal he was at the time. He's one of the most successful drug discovery scientists in the world. He discovered 2 of the 3 drugs in the triple cocktail for HIV. He also discovered the oral treatment for hepatitis C that's famously $1,000 a pill. But he argued that, what we need is not necessarily to reform intellectual property in order to create access in poor countries. What we need is to develop the capacity of poorer countries to make their own drugs. Then the drugs will be affordable and relevant to their needs. There's a lot we could say about that, about kind of questioning whether we may still want to challenge intellectual property laws even as we explore these other options. But I think what was really striking to me here was that I'd kind of taken for granted, I realized when I heard him speak, that Africans weren't going to be the ones who discovered drugs. And so why would I take that for granted when I think of myself as a decolonial science and technology studies scholar? It was quite striking to me. So Liotta was very interested in increasing capacity in Southern Africa to make these drugs. And so he first did something that was a very typical kind of approach, where you would build a postdoctoral program, where you would take these really well-trained chemistry PhD students from South Africa, give them this drug discovery and development training, and then send them back. But the problem is, there's not a robust drug discovery and development industry there. So if you give them these postdocs, you'll just feed brain drain. Like they'll be educated out of their own context. So what he and his collaborators decided to do was to also build commercial capacity at the same time. So they would found Temba, Pharmaceuticals, and then give the trained scientists a place to work. And it wasn't a one-to-one thing. It wasn't like after you've done this internship, now you have or this postdoc, now you have a job. It wasn't something like that. But it was this idea that you have to build the kind of academic excellence at the same time that you build the economic opportunities, or else it won't work. And I think that there is something that's a fundamental critique of a lot of the activism around pharmaceuticals that's embedded in this. So you can see this even with great organizations that, of course, I support. So I like the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, which was revolutionary in providing access to antiretrovirals. But it led to this situation in which people say, Doctors Without Borders and other groups would say, okay, so millions of people rely on affordable medicines from India to stay alive, so let's protect that. But who says only India should have a pharmaceutical industry? And this is a particularly urgent question for South Africa because HIV medications are such a huge burden on the public health department in South Africa and not a very big priority for India. So Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers are now coming into line with intellectual property. That's why these cases are being fought. And there's a real question, will Indian companies still bother with the diseases of the poor now that they're going to be innovating for the rich? So is there a possibility that African countries will be left behind in this? There are other organizations that I think also kind of really assume that Africans are always going to be outside of the realm of knowledge producers. So Gates certainly, like all of his big challenges things, are assuming that it's going to be people at institutions like this who are going to solve the problems of people far away. It's not going to be African scientists. And so I think that this is a problem, not just for someone like Gates, but even for the University of Adelaide for Essential Medicines, which was very strong when I was a PhD student at MIT. And I didn't even notice this problem with their logo at the time until I started paying attention to Temba, where they say, so the argument of these PhD students in the University of Adelaide for Essential Medicines is that because it's our drugs in our labs, it's our responsibility to make sure that drugs are affordable for people around the world. But who says they're just our drugs? Who says they're just our labs? Maybe everybody has a right not just to access pharmaceuticals as patients, but even to be pharmaceutical scientists. Generic drugs, of course, are really what we think about when we think about Africa. What about if we thought about innovative drugs as well? So the kind of core question is, how might this kind of a map be redrawn? So if you look at the map of drug discovery, pharmaceutical investment, right, so manufacturing as well as R&D and marketing, and so, I mean, obviously, the United States is going to be huge on the marketing kind of section there. But if you look at this map, right, South Africans and others are asking, how can we redraw that? So that we don't just have these big sectors in Brazil and a few other poor countries. I mean, Singapore is really doing its share there as well. How can we get in on this action? It's very difficult to do that because of the way that generic drugs are very, very cheap, very, very affordable. It's very difficult to compete on price. And because it's so many donors who are providing HIV drugs, usually, and governments, usually whoever's the cheapest wins. So how can a company in South Africa try to enter into this market if Indian companies can just undercut them until they go out of business? What Temba thought about doing as a way to do some disruptive innovation to try to work their way out of this problem was to combine the question of HIV drug manufacture, which would fund discovery, through solving another problem as well, which is an environmental problem. So pharmaceuticals are catastrophically polluting. They're nowhere near, the manufacture of pharmaceuticals is nowhere near as polluting as something like petroleum, because like when you think about the tons of petroleum that exist in the world, it's just going to make tons more waste. But in terms of the ratio between the product and the waste, it's one of the most wasteful industries that exists. So, where you're getting like 10% product, 90% waste in the manufacturing process. So maybe if you could find ways to make green pharmaceuticals, and if the EU is buying the drugs to provide to Africans, maybe they would be willing to pay a premium, or at least give you a break for a couple of years while you get your manufacturing going, so that way you can fund other things with a known buyer. And of course, we're all concerned now about the environment. I mean, we don't see health and the environment as completely separate in a way that maybe, was common in drug discovery paradigms of an earlier era. So a lot of people are aware of the problem of the waste of pharmaceuticals. We tend to be more aware of it actually in our water sources as products. So, when we say things, like doctors will sometimes say things like, oh, statins are so great, so like cholesterol-lowering drugs are so great, we should just put them in the water. Obviously, in places like this, they already are in the water, right? I mean, we excrete them, we throw them away, they're in our water, right? The manufacturing people know less about, but it's compelling, I think, on the face of it to say, look, rather than have 90% waste, I'm going to have 10% waste. I'm going to charge you a small premium until I get my manufacturing going, and then I'll be able to match the prices of the Indian competitors. So the way that they were going to do this was to use the expertise of one of their other board members. So I told you about one who was in Atlanta. This one is in Cambridge. And he's a leader in flow chemistry. So continuous flow chemistry is kind of the core idea. The easiest way to kind of understand how it works is to compare it with toast. So sorry about this getting broken off the line there, but a batch toaster is the kind of toaster you probably have at home. So you start one new process, you make the toast is done, end of process. Whereas a continuous flow one is more like at a hotel, where you have this thing going in continuous flow. Now, obviously, drugs are far more complicated than toast. There's basically one chemical reaction that's going on here, which is the dextrinization of starch. In drugs, you have a whole bunch of things that are happening. But you imagine this is like an iterative process. So normally when you make pharmaceuticals, what you do is you put together a couple of ingredients in a solvent, mix them together, take out the solvent. A lot of that becomes waste. Do your next step, take out the solvent. Do your next step, take out the solvent. And you're also starting and stopping all the time, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons that hotels and others rely on this kind of toaster, right? It's more efficient to just kind of keep it going rather than to have the start up to heat and then down, right? So this is a real different paradigm for drug discovery, for drug development and manufacture. So this is a batch process. You've got these huge vats, you've got huge processes, like big footprints of the companies that manufacture pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of problems with them as well. They're highly explosive. I mean, they have other issues if you want to set up a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant with batch processes. But in this process, what you want to do is you want to have all these things that become solids, and then you mix them, and you want them to become solids again. Continuous flow operates on a different model, where you want everything to stay fluid throughout until the final product, which usually you do want to be a pill, right? So you do want it to be solid in the end, but you use computers and tubes and careful programming to do the manufacture all in a row. And this is a flow chemistry kind of setup. You can't see it super well in this light, but it's got lots and lots of tubes and computers rather than big old vats. It's a really different kind of model of what it would look like. A really idealized vision of what this would look like is something like this, right? You put all this stuff in, and sure, you get a little bit in and out along the way, and then you pop out with pills. Now, there's something that's very interesting about imagining this technology being a source of innovation for South Africa, because in a lot of ways it's opposite of what its previous expertise had been. So this company called Sasol was a state corporation, is a state corporation now, but very important under apartheid. So one of the challenges that the apartheid government faced was that it was facing sanctions because people across the world did not agree with its discriminatory policies, and it wanted a source of liquid fuel that it could make itself. Now, South Africa doesn't have petroleum. So what they did was had a company, which is kind of a public-private amalgam, make the ability to do liquid fuel from coal. So this would allow you to be energy independent, even if all of the coal, even if all of the oil, all of the countries with oil decided to boycott you, and you would be able to kind of continue on, right, with your apartheid system, was the way that this would work. But this technology, I mean, they did develop it. I mean, it was originally conceived in Nazi Germany out of similar kind of worries about whether the Nazis would be cut off from the world. And but the South Africans developed it and found that you could do it, but it's catastrophically polluting. I mean, just like really, really wasteful way to make petroleum. And here they're trying to do something that's the opposite. So they're trying to make a green technology, but yet it still has this idea of, okay, we're going to challenge these ideas about what should be liquid and what should be solid as we develop something that's absolutely vital. And what they were trying to do is, so part of it is to build on this history of innovation in South Africa, where, okay, we're going to solve a problem in a different way from what everyone else is doing so that we have our competitive advantage or we can sustain ourselves. But it's also a way to see that the effects of infrastructural lock-in that others are suffering from are something that you don't necessarily have to suffer from. So I started thinking about this when I was, mentioned I was living in Atlanta, and these lock-in effects of infrastructure. So if you were to develop pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity now, you wouldn't do it in this highly polluting way. You would come up with a different way. But we're already invested. We already have it built. We already have this processes. So it's really hard for any company to be the first one to stop. And in a way, it's a lot like roads. Like if you were to develop transportation for a major city like Atlanta, you would not build these huge roads. But now that you have the huge roads, you get into these situations with major crises. So one thing that happened, we had an ice storm several years ago, and the traffic all came to a standstill, right? But you have infrastructural lock, and all you can do is go in more and more and more on the same technologies. So is it possible to instead leapfrog? Which of course is something that's a famous idea in South Africa, in Africa as a whole actually, right? So where the lack of the bad infrastructure becomes understood to be a condition of possibility for developing the new infrastructure. Most famously in Africa, this has happened with regard to phones. So there's been a long history of conversations around, okay, there's a problem with, one of the barriers to development in Africa is the lack of landlines. So because you don't have a landline phone grid, therefore you can't do these information and communication intensive industries, which are the industries of the future, so therefore we can't solve the problem. But mobile phones have changed that dynamic considerably. And indeed, a lot of the innovation around phones has happened in Africa. So when you think about payment technologies and these things, a lot of them are developed by and for the continent. And so thinking about like, okay, how can we see that the lack of the existing infrastructure is a condition of possibility of being innovative in the future is something that has really got an intuitive appeal in South Africa and more broadly. Again, this actually did turn out to be a failure. The government initially said that they would buy the technologies for the company or help them broker the technologies for the company so that they could at least do proof of concept, so that then they could start manufacturing, so that then, and then they could make it happen. This was not possible. And some of the reasons are really mundane. I mean, so for example, the Department of Science and Technology has its set of imperatives. It needs you to have innovations that get to market quickly. Pharmaceuticals are never going to be the quickest. Versus the Department of Health, it needs the cheapest thing today. And so it doesn't really have, and this wasn't funded through the Department of Health anyway. So there's no real way to make these incentives align yet, where the Department of Health would benefit from the Department of Science and Technology's investment in green pharmaceutical manufacture that would make South Africans HIV pharmaceutical independent and potentially build a base on which they could do innovative manufacture. But the story is not completely over here for flow chemistry in South Africa. One of the scientists who had actually done a period of secondment in Cambridge, so had gone as a visiting researcher to Cambridge, is now, and after Temba folded, he went to Pretoria and became a professor there, and he has been successful in setting up a flow chemistry lab. And what he's found useful is to start with pesticides and agricultural products, which are much easier to get through regulatory hurdles than pharmaceuticals are. And so by building first some agricultural supply manufacture using flow chemistry, he's trying to build the capacity that way. And it's seeming like it's working. And he's a canny a kind of canny innovator who learned something from the experiences of a Temba. So he became very good at saying, okay, I'm going to leverage my access to private money to demand money from the National Research Foundation, and I'm going to leverage National Research Foundation money to ask for money from private funders. So, and certainly purchase guarantees. I mean, that's really the big thing, right? If you know you have cash flow in the future, that's as good as having money now. And that's what always the drug discovery enterprise is really challenged for, because you don't know you'll have a product in the future, much less one that can be profitable. It's not clear whether this particular technology will be the one that will lead to the kind of future of disruptive innovation in the pharmaceutical space or otherwise in South Africa. But I think that it does point to the fact that the failure of the instance is not the failure of the dream. So, and it's not the end of the aspiration. I mean, there will always be like paying attention to why these initiatives succeed to the limited measure in which they do, and what ultimately holds them back is actually useful for future innovators who are trying to think about, okay, how can we do this effort to redraw the map of drug discovery and potentially even have these things actually align. I mean, right now, this alignment is very hard to achieve. So the alignment of inexpensive with innovation is very hard to achieve. And even innovation with infectious is relatively hard to achieve, right? I mean, that's not where most of the drug discovery and development is going on in the global north or otherwise. But I think that by paying attention to actually existing post-colonial scientists and seeing what they're doing in their diverse contexts, we can see that even if my story is a tragic one that I tell in the book, there is still hope. So I'll leave it there and welcome your questions. Thank you. Yes?
So there are about 375 companies in the market in Africa, 1.3 billion. Mm-hmm. You talked about to improve the industry, you need production capacity. But could you touch base on quality control and how to serve that big of a market?
Yeah.
Comparatively, there are about 5,000 to 10,000 companies in India and China for a market as big as Africa. So could you talk about the opportunities for regional hubs and the opportunities for Africa as a whole, also in the context of the free trade agreement that's recently?
Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a lot going on there. I mean, one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that actually the quality control now everywhere, like no one actually owns their own quality control in a sense, because we have FDA officials in India checking on labs if they want to provide to the US market, right? So there's like plural regimes within each context, given where they want to trade with. And under that model, Africans get worse products, right? So there have been a lot of studies of the ways that drug manufacturers and other product manufacturers, even food manufacturers in India and China, provide lower quality materials to their exports in Africa than they do to their exports in Europe and North America. It makes sense from a business perspective, right? So, those ones that demand higher quality controls, you're going to go ahead and develop the higher quality controls for those markets, and then the things that fail, you might seek other markets for. But this is actually one of the big incentives for South Africans to develop their own drug discovery and especially manufacturing capacity, because then they would control the quality control as well. And in general, actually quality control in South Africa anyway is better. I mean, it's like on par with other middle income countries. It's not worse. Nigeria, it's worse. I mean, I think, obviously the continent is diverse too. That there, because of the kind of the specific history of South Africa, it actually has more robust licensing and quality control. And I mean, it's complicated to think about how that operates in a regional setting. I mean, so many South Africans, and even those scientists who are coming from other parts of the region, they say, oh yeah, we want to serve the continent. South Africa is not always seen as beneficent to the rest of the continent, right? So, when South Africans say, "Oh, we want to help everyone here," it's like, well, sometimes other Africans are like, "Well, you have a history of doing things that are not necessarily helping the continent, and so we don't." There's a branding issue there, but I think that too is up for grabs because I started this research during the lead up to the World Cup. So the men's football World Cup was held in South Africa in 2010. And there was this very successful mobilization of African solidarity in that event. And so the fact that Africa is both a really complicated geographic area that's really heterogeneous and an idea that actually existing Africans mobilize around makes it actually a really interesting space to work in. Yes?
So there's been a lot of stuff in the news about anti-immigrant sentiments in South Africa because of high unemployment and the sense that, with populism on the rise everywhere, South Africa is experiencing that as well. So how does this kind of dream of Pan-African science for Africa play out, shift depending on, over the course of your research, depending on how the government positioned itself in the rest of Africa? And can you speak at all to kind of how it plays out today?
Yeah, there's great scholarship in the region about this. So folks like sociologist David Mansenhe have argued that actually that Pan-African dream was always elitist. It was always only believed by the elite. So Nelson Mandela, great, good for you, but all of the people for whom that resonated were middle class and above, even before. And that, and I don't know how familiar folks are with a lot of this really soaring rhetoric. So on the part of Nelson Mandela, on the part of Thabo Mbeki, on the part of so many who would talk about, the whole of Africa is my home and so on. But that never resonated with the people who were struggling for jobs in apartheid South Africa. And I obviously living in the United Kingdom now, right? There's this, it becomes increasingly impossible to ignore the way in which this elite dream of openness and service and, but what I'm doing is good for everyone, and the working and lower classes who are not convinced. And especially, of course, now, we're looking 25 years after democracy, and lots of people have yet to see economic improvement in their lives, and so they really are asking, okay, and they never were invested in that international dream. They might have been invested in the Rainbow Nation, but that was supposed to be narrower. It was supposed to be that Black South Africans and colored South Africans were going to get a bigger piece of the pie. It was never supposed to be this sweeping narrative that the anti-apartheid activists saw. Yes.
Thank you so much for this talk. You brought together the moving parts and complicated, and I think it's a very good inaugural development reimagining talk for this semester.
Thank you.
My question to you is basically, can you talk a little bit about the dichotomy between developing the capacity of South African scientists, if you will, but then actually, if you don't have a parallel infrastructure in place to absorb them and so that they can build it doesn't work, and that we still use that traditional approach, the capacity building, and we actually educate them out of the system.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So could you talk a little bit about why this failure to develop a parallel infrastructure continues, and what are the hurdles that nations, other than of course investment, they face? Is it political? Is it elsewhere? Is it because of this notion of neo-colonialism that is the brain power still needs? There are different theories around.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about that hole and gap?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, because I think that, I do think that maybe on the most fundamental level, it's the issue is that the apartheid state was a liberal state for a minority, And in a liberal state, you are allowed to spend money to give jobs, right? So like a liberal state has an incentive to create local industries because, you know, it's all part of one pot, right? A neoliberal state doesn't necessarily have an incentive to create jobs. I mean, it has like some cronyist jobs that it has to do, but it is supposed to be like, you know, working on a global scale and being, you know, not necessarily focused on creating jobs for South Africans. And it's really hard for the South African funders in technology to justify endeavors based on jobs. They have to justify it based on technology innovation. And even, you know, when you look at the health situation, I mean, like, so there's just this way in which, like, it's nobody's department is to create jobs. And so their incentives are different, right? So the Department of Health is supposed to maximize access to antiretrovirals. In the short term, that's going to be cheaper with generic drugs from elsewhere. So if you don't care about drugs and you don't care about a reliable supply in 5-10 years, if that's not one of your imperatives, then it's kind of on someone else's budget, right? But there's no one else's budget who that's on. And so the same thing goes for science and technology. So the science and technology, if anything, prioritizes things that create fewest jobs. Because it's like, you know, what they want to do is like be cost sustainable. And I think this is actually what, I mean, speaking especially with the bench scientists in South Africa, I think this is the thing that's most poignant for them. It's like, wait a second, the apartheid government could spend gazillions of dollars on moonshots, and the post-apartheid government has to nickel and dime for every little thing and can't like actually think big about anything. And somehow creating jobs is like automatically assumed to be a diversion of state resources when the apartheid government got to that, right? So there's a real like era change. And actually I think that this is one of the other problems with relying on the global north for development, because we're not investing, we being the United States, aren't investing on the scale that we were either. So, you know, if they're relying on the United States to be this engine, the United States is part of the same process of a real disinvestment in public interest science and technology. Yes.
Could you comment maybe some on the information technology side of things, the compute infrastructure in South Africa, the extent maybe to which artificial intelligence is currently being used in pharmaceutical research, and then also maybe the extent to which larger clustered compute systems are or are not available to researchers, the academic community, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the infrastructure for IT is much better in South Africa than it is in many of the other parts of Africa, in part because of this robust electrical grid, right? So this is this, you know, like way that even like Silicon Savannah, which is like more famous for IT development, so in Eastern Africa, centered in Kenya, if you look actually at the ability to access the grid, it's much higher in South Africa, which does create a lot of possibilities there. And certainly computational drug discovery is a promising area that many of the academic institutions in South Africa have been interested in. So what this involves, right, is that you would use models of the receptors for whatever it is that you're trying to disrupt, right? So I mean, HIV is a great case because, you know, it's like it's doing some retranscription, right? So you build a computer model that does that, and then you try to like look at other molecules that would fit in a particular way in order to disrupt it. And advanced computing can hold a lot of promise in that. Not that many drugs have been discovered that way yet, but there's certainly a lot of hope in it. What's not clear is that they would have an advantage there. It seems as if the Indian advantage there would be so high that they could get lucky. You know, like certainly a South African drug discovery company could get lucky, or a South African research lab could get lucky. I mean, when I mentioned the, you know, Liotta's drugs for HIV, those were discovered at Emory University. I mean, it was publicly funded research and public science. And so it certainly could happen in South Africa or elsewhere, but it's not clear that they would have a competitive advantage relative to the rest of the world.
We have time for about one more.
Great,
Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving such a enlightening talk. Based on knowing what you know of the continent, Is there a hope for new startup companies to be able to compete in the global market, knowing that there's a locking? You also, what do you see in the future?
Yeah. No, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say, right? I mean, I think it's an interesting kind of question too, because there are even South Africans who are in those industries, right? So Elon Musk being the most famous, where it seems as if the the kind of startup funding streams that are available here, broadly here, right? So Silicon Valley or whatever, seems as though they should be available in Africa, right? Those should actually be able to move. And yet the financing is not moving. I do think, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, like so I think that even Bill Gates is starting to change, and I guess that maybe is what it would rely on. So after Temba, even before Temba failed, another initiative emerged called H3D at the University of Cape Town, also a public-private partnership, also doing drug discovery for TB, HIV, and malaria, but based on a university campus, so easier to get philanthropic money. And even though Gates historically hasn't really funded scientists who don't have the track records, he has been willing to fund them. And so I think that there's this thing of, that it'll take a leap of faith. Actually, I just had my book launch in Atlanta the other day, my US book launch. I had the first one in Johannesburg, then a little local one in London, but then you have to come to the United States as well. And Dennis Liotta was one of my respondents. And a South African in the audience said, like, isn't this just impossible? Like, didn't you just, like, it's so, the problems are so fundamental, like, isn't it just impossible to change what's going on in Africa? And he pointed out, I mean, so on the one hand, there are these still inspirational ideas from Nelson Mandela about, everything looks impossible until it's done, right? But also, there's for him, I mean, discovering the second generation antiretrovirals that turned HIV into a chronic disease, I mean, nobody thought his lab could do that either. Nobody thought that would come out of a university. Nobody thought those things, and so it's super unlikely. But if people stick at it long enough and kind of keep learning from and kind of recreating and paying attention to the social at the same time that they pay attention to the technical and pay attention to the way the markets work at the same time that they pay attention to the way the financing works, I don't know what it'll be, but I think that there will be something else. All done?
Thank you, Dr. Pollock.
Thank you.